Before you leave, tell me your last wish, she smirked. Then the billionaire appeared behind her. She thought this was the night she would die. Renee knelt on the cold marble floor of the house she had cleaned for 11 years, a rope trembling in another man's hands. He leaned close and whispered 4 words she would never forget. Tell me your last wish. She didn't cry. She didn't beg. She just stared past him toward the front door, holding on to a hope she no longer believed in. Then she heard it. Footsteps in the hallway, slow, certain, a voice she recognized cutting through the silence. And in that single moment, everything in that room changed forever. Hey friends, welcome back to the channel. If this is your first time here, we share real, emotional, true-to-life stories about ordinary people who find extraordinary courage. And today's story might be one of the most powerful we've ever told. Before we start, drop a comment and let us know what city you're watching from tonight. We love seeing where our story family comes from. This one is tense, it's emotional, and it's going to stay with you long after it ends. So get comfortable because Renee's story is about to begin. Renee always said the house remembered everything. She just didn't know yet how much it would remember about her. The Bellamy estate sat at the top of a long gravel driveway on the edge of Ashford Hills, a quiet town where the mornings smelled like cut grass and the evenings were so still you could hear the sprinklers 2 houses down. Renee Walker had been walking through that gravel every weekday morning for 11 years. Her sneakers crunching in the same rhythm, her thermos of coffee in one hand and her keys to the side door in the other. She knew this house better than she knew her own reflection. She knew which floorboard in the east hallway creaked, which window in the library never closed all the way in the summer, which room caught the first light of morning best. 11 years will do that to a person. She was 37 now, though most people guessed younger, and she carried herself the way women do when they've spent their whole lives being the one who holds things together. Her son Malik was 19, in his 2nd year of nursing school 2 towns over, and every part of Renee's life had been quietly built around getting him there. She worked 6 days a week. She skipped things other people didn't think twice about. New shoes, nights out, sleep. She didn't mind. She used to tell Dolores, the estate's cook and her closest friend in that big house, that raising a good son was the only inheritance she cared about leaving behind. Dolores Reyes had been with the Bellamy family even longer than Renee, and the 2 of them had a rhythm to their days that felt less like work and more like companionship. Coffee at 6. A shared laugh over something one of them read on their phone. Complaints about the guests who never said thank you. It was Dolores who first told Renee, all those years ago, that the man who owned this house was not like other rich men she'd worked for. Marcus Bellamy was 38, the CEO of a technology company his father had built from nothing, and he had inherited both the business and, it seemed, his father's old-fashioned belief that the people who kept his home running deserved to be treated like family. He traveled constantly, half the year, some seasons more, but when he was home he knew Renee's name, asked about Malik by name, remembered that she took her coffee black. He had given her a set of keys to the estate the year his father passed, a gesture that meant more to Renee than any raise ever could. Trust in a house like this was the real currency. Her dreams were small and specific, the way real dreams usually are. A little house of her own, nothing fancy, with a porch big enough for 2 chairs. Malik's tuition paid off before he graduated so he could start his career without debt hanging over him. Maybe someday a garden like the one she tended here. She had turned the estate's side yard into something beautiful over the years, roses she'd planted herself, herbs Dolores used in the kitchen. It wasn't hers, but tending it felt like hers. Marcus's younger sister, Claire, lived at the estate too. She was 27, warm in a way that made the big house feel less empty when Marcus was traveling, and she had always treated Renee less like staff and more like someone who'd watched her grow up, which in a way Renee had. Claire used to sit at the kitchen island as a teenager, doing homework while Renee dusted the shelves nearby, asking her opinion on boys and colleges and everything in between. So when Claire got engaged that spring, Renee was one of the first people she told, practically glowing as she held out her hand to show the ring. The fiancé's name was Preston Vale. He was 30, handsome in the way that photographs well, with a laugh that filled a room and a way of making everyone at a dinner party feel like the most interesting person there. Claire adored him. Marcus, cautious as always with anyone new around his sister, seemed to be warming to him too. But Renee noticed things. She always had. It was part of the job, moving quietly through a house, seeing the version of people that exists when they think no one important is watching. She noticed that Preston's charm had an off switch. Once, she'd been trimming the hedges near the garage when he snapped at the teenage boy who helped with the lawn, blaming him for a scratch on his car that Renee was fairly certain had been there before. The boy apologized 3 times. Preston didn't accept it, just walked away muttering. Another time, Renee found a torn $20 bill in the laundry, the kind of thing that happens when someone crumples cash in anger rather than in carelessness, right after Preston had stormed out of Marcus's study. Small things. Nothing she could name exactly. But she had spent her whole life reading rooms for a living, and something about Preston Vale didn't sit right with her. It came to a head, quietly the way these things always start, on a Tuesday afternoon in early October. Renee was polishing the banister in the main hallway when she heard Preston's voice through the half-open door of Marcus's home office, low and clipped in a way she'd never heard him speak before. He was on the phone. "I told you it has to be settled before Marcus gets back," he was saying. "Before he finds out about the account. I don't care how you do it. Just handle it." Renee kept polishing. She told herself it wasn't her business. Rich men talked about money in tones like that all the time, arguments about investments, deals, things she didn't understand and didn't need to. But something about the words, "before he finds out," sat cold in her stomach, and she found herself replaying them the rest of the afternoon. That weekend, Malik came home to visit, and for 2 full days Renee let herself forget about it entirely. She made his favorite dinner, listened to him talk about his rotations at the hospital, felt her chest swell with a pride so big it almost hurt. This was why she did all of it. This boy becoming a man, becoming exactly who she'd hoped he'd be. Sunday night, driving him back to campus, she felt lighter than she had in weeks. But Monday morning, walking up that familiar gravel driveway, thermos in hand, she couldn't shake the feeling that something in that house had shifted while she wasn't looking. She didn't know what it was yet. She only knew, the way you know a storm is coming before the sky changes color, that it was coming. There was one more thing that stayed with her from that week, small enough that she almost didn't notice it at the time. She'd been dusting the frames along the main staircase. Decades of Bellamy family photographs, weddings and birthdays, and a young Marcus standing awkwardly beside his father at some old company event, when she paused at a newer photo near the bottom. Claire and Preston at their engagement dinner, both of them laughing at something out of frame. Renee remembered thinking at the time, how easy it was to photograph happiness and how little a picture could ever tell you about what was really happening in a house. She thought, too, about her own life outside these walls. The small apartment she'd kept for Malik's room even after he left for school, the years right after his father left when it had just been the 2 of them and whatever jobs she could string together. Cleaning houses had never been the plan. It had simply been the thing that worked, and it had eventually led her, through a friend of Dolores's cousin, to the Bellamy estate. She didn't resent the work. She was proud of it, proud of the trust she'd built over a decade, proud that a man like Marcus Bellamy handed her his house keys without a second thought. That pride was part of what made the strange tension with Preston sting more than it should have. She had earned her place in that house. She wasn't about to let some uneasy feeling take it from her. Still walking home that Friday evening, the last light draining slowly out of the sky over Ashford Hills, Renee found herself glancing back at the estate once, the way you glance at a room you're not sure you'll see the same way again. Have you ever had a gut feeling about someone that turned out to be true? Tell us in the comments. Renee used to believe that if you kept your head down and did good work, trouble would simply pass you by. That week she started to learn how wrong she was. Began small. Preston started finding fault with things that had never been a problem before. A windowsill she'd dusted 1,000 times, the way she'd folded the towels in the guest bathroom, the time she took for her lunch break. None of it made sense on its own. Together, it felt like something else entirely, like he was building a case against her, brick by brick, for reasons she couldn't understand. She mentioned it to Dolores one evening while they were closing up the kitchen. Dolores set down the dish towel she was holding and got quiet in a way that made Renee's stomach tighten. "You know," Dolores said slowly, "before you, there was another woman who worked here. Teresa Alvarez. Good worker, kind woman. She left real sudden, right around the time Preston started coming around more. Never said goodbye properly. Marcus was traveling that whole month and never really got the full story." Dolores shrugged like she was trying to make it sound like nothing. "Probably not connected. Just, be careful, that's all I'm saying." Renee filed that away, the same way she'd filed away the torn 20 and the phone call. Small pieces that didn't fit together yet. Claire, meanwhile, was buried in wedding planning, and if she noticed any tension between her fiancé and the household staff, she didn't show it. She'd pull Renee aside to ask her opinion on flower arrangements or seating charts, and Renee always gave her honest answers, the way she had since Claire was a teenager. There was a particular afternoon when Claire sat at the kitchen island, overwhelmed with lists, and confessed quietly that she sometimes felt like she barely had time to just be excited about marrying the man she loved. Renee squeezed her shoulder and told her that was normal, that weddings had a way of swallowing the joy they were supposed to celebrate. She meant it. She also, if she was honest with herself, felt a small ache of worry she couldn't quite explain. The real trouble started on a Thursday. Renee was cleaning near Marcus's home office, a room she was allowed in, had always been allowed in, had dusted 1,000 times without incident, when Preston came around the corner and found her there. His face changed the moment he saw her. "What are you doing in here?" he asked, and his voice had an edge she'd never heard him use with her directly. "Cleaning, same as always," she said, keeping her voice level, though her pulse had already picked up. "You don't need to be in this room. Not without me here." He stepped closer, close enough that she instinctively took a step back. "Actually, I think it'd be better if you stopped cleaning in here altogether. I'll mention it to Marcus." Renee didn't argue. Arguing wasn't a luxury she could afford, not with Malik's tuition due and her own rent climbing every year. But that night, lying awake, she turned the moment over and over. He hadn't just been annoyed. He'd been afraid. She recognized fear when she saw it. She'd felt enough of it in her own life to know its shape on someone else's face, even when it was dressed up as anger. A few days later, Claire found her in the laundry room, distressed. "Preston says some money's gone missing from the household account," Claire said, twisting her engagement ring the way she did when she was nervous. "Not a huge amount, but he thinks maybe someone on staff." She stopped herself, looking miserable. "I told him that's ridiculous. I know you, Renee. I've known you my whole life." Renee felt the floor tilt slightly under her feet. "I haven't touched anything that isn't mine to touch," she said quietly. "You know that." "I know," Claire said quickly. "I know. I wanted you to hear it from me, not from him." That was almost worse. Renee thanked her and went back to work, hands trembling slightly as she folded sheets that no longer felt like they belonged to a home she trusted. Marcus was away that whole stretch. A business trip overseas, harder than usual to reach, the kind of trip where even Claire only heard from him in short, delayed messages. Renee found herself missing his presence in a way she hadn't expected. When he was home, the house felt balanced. Without him, it felt like something was quietly tilting off its axis, and only she seemed to notice. It was the following Monday, taking out the recycling from the office, that she found it. A single page, torn and crumpled, half buried under other discarded papers. She almost tossed it without looking, but something about the handwriting caught her eye. Preston's handwriting, tight and slanted, next to columns of numbers that didn't look like anything she'd seen in this house's regular accounts. Withdrawals. A name that wasn't Marcus's or Claire's. She didn't understand all of it. But she understood enough to know it wasn't nothing. Her hands shook as she smoothed the page out and, without fully deciding to, folded it small and tucked it into her apron pocket instead of the recycling bin. She told herself she'd figure out what to do with it later. She told herself it was probably nothing. That evening, she almost showed it to Dolores. She got as far as pulling it out of her apron pocket in the kitchen, unfolding it halfway on the counter, before something made her fold it back up again. Dolores had a family of her own to protect, a husband with a bad knee who couldn't work the way he used to, 2 grown kids who still called her for help some months. Renee didn't want to hand her a problem that wasn't hers to carry. So she said nothing and took the page home instead, tucked at the bottom of her bag under her wallet, where it sat for days like a stone she couldn't put down. She thought about calling Marcus directly. She had his number. He'd given it to her years ago, in case of emergencies at the house, a burst pipe or an alarm going off with no one home. But what would she even say? That she'd found a page with numbers on it while taking out the recycling. That Preston had looked frightened when he realized it was missing. It sounded small out loud, almost silly, and some old tired part of her worried that raising it without proof would only confirm whatever quiet suspicion Preston had already planted about her. The following week, the tension in the house grew heavier in ways that were harder to explain than to feel. Preston started finding reasons to be near her when she worked. Not confrontational exactly, but watchful, the way a person watches something they're afraid might go off. He asked her once, too casually, whether she'd found anything unusual lately while cleaning. She told him no. He didn't quite believe her. She could see it in the small tightening around his eyes. Claire, still wrapped up in wedding planning and blissfully unaware of the undercurrent running beneath her own engagement, mentioned one afternoon that Preston had seemed distracted lately, distant in a way that worried her. "Do you think it's normal?" she asked Renee, twisting a dish towel in her hands. "Getting cold feet, before a wedding?" Renee didn't have the heart or the proof to tell her the truth she suspected. She simply said that everyone gets nervous before big changes, and hoped, not for the first time that week, that she was wrong about all of it. Have you ever felt like someone was trying to push you out of a place you'd worked hard for? Share your story below. Everything was about to change, and Renee had no idea how close it already was. Marcus was still overseas. His return delayed again, and the house had settled into an emptier kind of quiet. Claire had gone to stay with a friend for a few days to finalize wedding details away from the noise of the estate. Dolores had left early that Friday for a family matter, which meant that on a cold, ordinary Friday evening, Renee was alone in the house, finishing the last of her cleaning before heading home, when Preston walked into the kitchen and closed the door behind him. "I know you took something," he said. No greeting. No pretense of the charm he wore so easily for everyone else. Renee's whole body went still. "I don't know what you're talking about. Don't." His voice cracked with something that wasn't quite anger and wasn't quite panic. A desperate, cornered sound. "I saw the recycling. That page is missing. I know you have it." She thought about lying. She thought about handing it over and pretending she'd never read it. But some part of her, the same part that had spent 19 years teaching her son to tell the truth even when it cost him something, refused to fold. "I found a page with your handwriting on it," she said carefully. "Numbers I didn't understand. Withdrawals from an account that wasn't yours. I didn't do anything with it. I wasn't going to. You're lying." He crossed the kitchen fast, faster than she expected, and something in his face had gone somewhere she didn't recognize. It spilled out of him then, half confession, half collapse, the gambling debts that had piled up over 2 years, the money he'd been quietly siphoning from the family trust to cover them, the forged signature he'd practiced until it looked close enough to Claire's that no one would question it at a glance. Marcus comes home in 2 days, he said, his voice shaking. 2 days and it's over. Everything is over. Unless you don't say anything. I won't say anything, Renee said, and she meant it in that moment, more out of fear than loyalty. Please. Have a son. I just want to go home. But something in him had already crossed a line he couldn't walk back from. He grabbed her arm before she could reach the door, and what happened over the next several minutes was the kind of thing Renee would spend a long time afterward trying not to remember in full detail. Being dragged toward the garage, seeing the coil of rope on the workbench where the gardening tools were kept, understanding with a clarity that felt almost peaceful what he intended to make this look like. An accident. A choice she never made. He forced her to her knees in the front hallway, under the chandelier she had dusted 100 times, and looped the rope with hands that were shaking almost as badly as hers. "Tell me your last wish," he said, and there was no charm left in his voice at all, just something hollow and afraid of itself. Renee didn't answer. She thought of Malik. His face at 19, the man he was becoming, the graduation she would not be there to see if this was really how it ended. She thought of her mother, gone 8 years now, and wondered if she'd see her soon. She did not cry. She did not beg. She simply stared past Preston toward the front door, holding on to a hope she no longer fully believed in. That was when she heard it. The sound of tires on gravel, faster than usual. Car door. Footsteps taking the front steps 2 at a time. The door opened, and Marcus Bellamy stood in the entryway of his own home, still in his travel coat, staring at a scene his mind clearly could not process fast enough. For one frozen second nobody moved. "How did you get here?" Preston's voice cracked, the rope still in his hands. "You weren't supposed to be back until Sunday." Marcus crossed the room before Preston finished the sentence, hauling him back from Renee with a strength that came from somewhere far past anger. "Dolores called me," he said. His voice low and shaking with fury he was visibly fighting to control. "She said something felt wrong. I don't know if it was God or luck or just a good woman trusting her instincts, but something told me to change my flight and come home tonight, to help someone who needed it. And I am so sorry I almost didn't make it in time." He got the rope off Renee himself, his hands gentler with her than they had been with Preston, and helped her to her feet as she finally let herself shake. Preston tried to run. He didn't get far. Marcus blocked the door, and within minutes the sound of sirens was cutting through the quiet of Ashford Hills, red and blue light spilling across the gravel driveway that Renee had walked up 1,000 ordinary mornings before this one. For a moment after the rope came off, nobody in the entryway moved. Renee sat on the bottom step where Marcus had gently lowered her, her hands still shaking too hard to hold the glass of water Marcus pressed into them. Preston stood pinned against the wall by the front door, Marcus's forearm braced across his chest, his charming, practiced composure completely gone, replaced by something raw and childlike in its panic. "Marcus, I can explain everything," he kept saying over and over, as though repeating it enough times might make it true. "You can explain it to the police," Marcus said, and his voice was quieter now, but somehow harder than it had been moments before. He didn't look away from Preston, not even to check on Renee, though she could feel how carefully he was keeping himself between the two of them, a wall built out of pure instinct. Renee kept replaying the sound of the car in her mind, the impossible timing of it, footsteps arriving in the exact window between one heartbeat and the next. Later, she would ask Marcus how he'd known, really known, to come home 2 days early on the one night it mattered most. He would tell her that Dolores had called him that afternoon, restless with a worry she couldn't quite name, mentioning offhand that things at the house had felt strange lately, that Renee had seemed shaken the last time they'd spoken. It wasn't proof of anything. It wasn't even a full sentence of concern. But Marcus had been on a plane within 2 hours, unable to explain to himself why it suddenly felt urgent, only that it did. The police arrived within 15 minutes, red and blue lights spilling silently across the gravel driveway, turning the front of the house into something that looked almost unreal, like a scene from a show rather than the entryway Renee had swept 1,000 ordinary mornings. She answered the first officer's questions in a voice that felt like it belonged to someone else, watching from a distance as Preston was walked, handcuffed, past the staircase he had once complained she hadn't dusted well enough. What would you do if you were in Renee's place? Tell us honestly in the comments. The house that had always felt so steady to Renee now felt like a place she barely recognized. The police took statements late into the night. Renee answered every question in a voice that didn't quite sound like her own, wrapped in a blanket someone had draped over her shoulders, Marcus sitting beside her the entire time, refusing to leave. Preston was arrested before midnight, charged with fraud, forgery, and assault. His composed, charming mask gone completely, replaced by something small and frightened that Renee almost felt sorry for. Almost. Claire arrived the next morning, called back early from her friend's house, and the sound she made when Marcus told her everything was one Renee would never forget. Not anger first, but grief, the kind that comes from loving someone whose whole self turns out to have been a performance. She sat with Renee for a long time that day, holding her hand, apologizing over and over for things that weren't her fault. "I should have seen it," Claire kept saying. "I should have listened when things felt off." Renee told her the truth. That people who are good at hiding things are good at hiding them from everyone, not just the people who love them. The engagement ended within the week. Claire mailed the ring back to a return address she'd later admit she hoped he'd never open. For Renee, the days that followed were harder in a different way. The fear didn't leave just because Preston was in custody. She startled at sudden sounds. She had trouble sleeping in her own apartment, let alone imagining walking back through that front hallway. Malik came home for a long weekend the moment he heard, and it was him, sitting across from her at the kitchen table, who finally said out loud what she'd been avoiding. "Mom, you have to tell the police everything. Not just what happened that night. Everything you saw before it, too." She hesitated. It wasn't only fear of Preston anymore. His father, she'd since learned, was a well-connected local attorney with friends in the district attorney's office, and within days a lawyer representing the Vale family had quietly reached out with an offer. A significant settlement, more money than Renee had ever seen in her life, in exchange for a private resolution and her silence about the details. It was tempting in a way she felt guilty even admitting. That kind of money could pay off Malik's tuition in full. It could put a down payment on the little house with the porch she'd dreamed about for years. Nobody would blame her for taking it. She had already been through enough. But then Dolores told her something that changed the shape of the decision entirely. Teresa Alvarez, the housekeeper who had left so suddenly years before Renee had ever heard her name, had reached out. She'd seen the news. And in a long, careful phone call, she told Renee the truth she'd never told anyone. Preston had cornered her 2 years earlier, when she'd stumbled onto an early version of the same scheme. Not with a rope. With threats against her family's immigration status, real or not. Enough to terrify her into disappearing without a word to anyone. She had carried that secret and that shame alone for years, believing no one would believe a housekeeper over a man like Preston Vale. Renee sat with that for a long time after the call ended. She thought about how many other women there might have been in the years between Teresa and herself, women whose names she'd never know, whose fear had been someone else's convenient silence. Marcus, when she told him what she was considering, didn't push her either way. He simply said that whatever she chose, he would support her completely. A full-time position with the estate for as long as she wanted it, a lawyer of her own if she needed one, security if she was afraid. "You don't owe anyone your story," he told her. "Not even me. But if you do decide to tell it, you won't be telling it alone." That night, Renee sat on her small apartment balcony long after Malik had gone to sleep, looking out at a sky that didn't have any answers in it, only stars. She thought about the little house with the porch. She thought about Teresa Alvarez, alone for years with a secret that had eaten at her quietly the whole time. She thought about every woman who might come after her, working in houses like the Bellamy estate, trusting families they worked for, vulnerable in ways no one talked about out loud. By morning, she had made her decision. She called the lawyer representing the Vale family first, and declined the settlement plainly, without anger, though her voice shook slightly as she said it. Then she called the detective handling the case and told him there was more to add to her statement: the overheard phone call months earlier, the torn ledger page she'd kept folded at the bottom of her bag all this time, and with Teresa's permission, the story of what had happened to the housekeeper who'd come before her. Malik drove home the following weekend, insisting on it even though Renee told him he didn't need to miss classes for her. He sat beside her at the kitchen table while she went through her statement one more time before submitting it, reading over her shoulder, occasionally reaching out to squeeze her hand at the parts that were hardest to write. "You always told me that doing the right thing isn't supposed to be easy," he said quietly at one point. "You just didn't tell me it would be this hard to actually do it." Claire came by too in those weeks, though her visits were quieter than they used to be. Heavier with an apology she kept trying and failing to fully put into words. She told Renee that she'd started going through old messages, old moments, looking for the signs she'd missed, and that some part of her would probably always wonder how she hadn't seen the truth about the man she'd almost married. Renee told her gently that loving someone doesn't come with a warning system, and that blaming herself for someone else's deception wouldn't undo any of it. It would only take something else away from her that she didn't need to lose. Word of the case moved slowly through Ashford Hills the way news does in small towns, in half-versions and rumors, most of them wrong. A few neighbors who had never once acknowledged Renee by name suddenly had opinions about what she should or shouldn't have done. She learned, in that stretch, to let most of it pass over her without landing. She had Malik. She had Dolores. She had, unexpectedly, a growing friendship with a woman in another state who understood, better than almost anyone, exactly what she had been carrying. What would you have done in Renee's shoes? Take the settlement or speak the truth? Let us know in the comments. The morning of the hearing, Renee wore the navy blue dress she'd bought for Malik's high school graduation, the nicest thing she owned, and stood a little straighter than she felt. Malik drove her there himself, holding her hand in the parking lot for a long moment before they went in, telling her that whatever happened inside that building, he was already proud of her for walking through the door at all. The courtroom wasn't the dramatic place television made it look like. It was quiet, fluorescent lit, full of people shuffling papers. But when Renee was called to speak, something in her steadied. She told the truth, plainly and completely. The torn ledger page, the phone call she'd overheard months earlier, the rope, the 4 words she would never forget. She spoke of Teresa Alvarez, too, who had flown in the night before and sat in the gallery, holding her own husband's hand, finally unburdened of a secret she'd carried alone for years. When the prosecutor asked Renee why she hadn't accepted the settlement that would have made all of this disappear quietly, she answered simply, "Because silence is exactly what let this happen twice. I wasn't going to let it happen a third time to somebody else." Preston was convicted on all charges. The judge's sentencing referenced specifically the pattern of intimidation against employees who had trusted him, a detail that made Renee's throat tighten, not with satisfaction exactly, but with something closer to relief. It was over. Not perfectly, not painlessly, but over. In the weeks that followed, life slowly found a new normal, though it was a different normal than the one Renee had known before. Marcus insisted on paying off the remainder of Malik's tuition himself, not as charity, he was careful to say, but as thanks for something money could never really cover. Renee tried to refuse at first, out of the same pride that had carried her through 11 years of hard work, until Marcus told her plainly that some debts aren't about money at all. They're about making sure the people who protect what matters most to you are never left standing alone again. The little house with a porch stopped being a faraway dream and started being something Renee could actually picture herself walking into. She and Malik found one that spring, small and a little worn around the edges, with a front porch just wide enough for 2 chairs. Dolores helped her move in. Claire brought a housewarming gift that made Renee laugh until she cried. A small potted rose bush, cut from the very garden Renee had spent 11 years tending at the estate. Claire, for her part, had spent that same year slowly rebuilding herself, first with time away and eventually with a quiet return to a life she got to choose on her own terms. She and Renee stayed close, closer even than before, and Claire liked to say, half joking, half not, that Renee had taught her more about real strength in that 1 year than anyone else had in 27 years combined. Renee always told her the same thing back, that Claire had shown plenty of strength of her own, walking away from a life she'd planned so carefully the moment she learned the truth, instead of looking away from it. The final surprise came the following fall, at Malik's nursing school pinning ceremony. Renee sat in the third row, tears already streaming before the ceremony even started, and turned to see Marcus Bellamy quietly taking the seat beside her. Not because anyone had invited him, but because he said simply, "Family shows up." Beside him sat Teresa Alvarez, who had stayed in touch with Renee ever since the trial, the two of them having formed a friendship neither had expected but both were grateful for, two women who understood something about each other that words didn't fully need to explain. In the years since, Renee has told the story of that night only a handful of times, and always for a reason. Once to a group of home care workers Marcus's company later partnered with on a fair treatment initiative, once to Malik's nursing class when a professor, having heard a version of the story secondhand, asked if Renee would come speak about advocating for yourself in vulnerable workplaces. She never set out to become anyone's example. She simply answered honestly when people asked, and found, to her quiet surprise, that her honesty seemed to help. Teresa Alvarez moved 2 towns over from Renee the following year, close enough that the two of them started a habit of Sunday phone calls that neither of them had expected to need as much as they did. They didn't talk about that night often. Mostly they talked about ordinary things. Teresa's grandchildren, Renee's garden, a recipe one of them had tried and wanted to pass along. But every so often, one of them would say something small that circled back to what they'd both survived, and the other would simply say, "I know," and that would be enough. Dolores stayed on at the Bellamy estate, still making coffee at 6 every morning, though these days it was for a rotating handful of staff Marcus had hired with far more careful attention than before. Background conversations, real interviews, a standing policy that any concern raised by household staff would go straight to him, no matter how small it seemed. He liked to say, when people asked why he'd changed so much about how the estate was run, that he'd learned the hard way what it costs a house to stop listening to the people who keep it standing. Renee thought, watching her son walk across that stage, about all the years she had spent believing that keeping her head down and staying quiet was the safest way to survive. She understood now that survival and safety weren't always the same thing, that sometimes the bravest thing a person can do is simply refuse to disappear quietly, even when disappearing would have been so much easier. To everyone watching who has ever felt small in a place that should have protected you, who has ever swallowed the truth because speaking it felt too dangerous, Renee's story is a reminder that your voice matters more than the silence anyone ever tried to buy from you. Courage doesn't always look like a grand gesture. Sometimes it just looks like one woman on her knees, refusing to give someone the satisfaction of her fear, and then, months later, standing up in a quiet courtroom and simply telling the truth. Thank you for walking through this story with us tonight. If it moved you the way it moved us, we hope you'll carry a piece of Renee's courage with you into your own life. If this story moved you even half as much as it moved us to tell it, do us a favor and hit that like button. It genuinely helps stories like Renee's reach the people who need to hear them most. If you're new here, consider subscribing because we share stories just like this one every single week. Real and raw and full of the kind of courage that reminds us what people are truly capable of. We'd love to know. Has there ever been a moment in your life where you had to choose between staying silent and telling the truth? Tell us about it in the comments below. We read every single one. And if you know someone who needs a reminder that their voice matters, please share this video with them tonight. Thank you for being part of this story family. We'll see you in the next one.